We're going to talk about the jighead minnow one more time, but I think I'm going to try to settle the debate of what it's actually called. I've heard so many different conflicting terms for the different techniques, which are all a little bit different. So I'll tell you what I've learned, my thoughts right now. Thanks for watching, and if you follow bass fishing, you know the jighead minnow is everywhere. I mean, it is dominating tournaments. It's changing the tackle that's used. It's also changing my job. I'm a writer, so I'm writing articles for different publications. So I talk to a lot of pro anglers, and it seems like I have written about the jighead minnow a million times. That is the dominant technique right now. It's everywhere you look, everyone's talking about it. But this is a video I've wanted to do for a while because I've heard so many conflicting names on the different techniques. You know, there's a lot of ways to do it. You know, people are casting a jighead and a minnow out there and watching their forward-facing sonar, but I've heard it called, you know, pinging a minnow. I've heard it called mid-strolling. I've heard it called hover strolling, moping, Damiki rig. I mean, there's so many different things, tight lining, but in my opinion, those are all completely different things. And I've talked to a lot of pros, a lot of people in the industry, and you know, I've kind of gathered a consensus of what each technique is and what it is actually called. So I'm going to do this again. This is what I've heard from everybody, the kind of consensus. I'm open to being corrected, so let me know if I'm on pace with this. But let's start with the Damiki rig, because the Damiki rig has kind of become like the Kleenex of this technique. You know, everyone says always throw a Damiki rig, but the Damiki rig is not casting out there and shaking a minnow. It is using a Damiki head like this and a Damiki bait, and it is more vertical. I mean, this is something I've been doing for several years now. I mean, we all kind of got wind of this with that tournament at Cherokee a few years ago that Wheeler won. It was one he jumped in Connell's boat when his boat broke down. People didn't know if it was legal or not, but it was. That was part of what happened there. Jesse Wiggins did really good in that tournament. It was a cold water, deep water, clear water, smallmouth tournament, and mainly 2D sonar because live scope wasn't out yet. But Damiki rig, ever since then I've been using it. It is basically vertical. You drop it down there, watch your 2D sonar, you see the line of the bait, and the bass comes up and grabs it. You know, it's basically not really doing anything, but the bait is just sitting there vertically. The fish see it and they just appear off the bottom. You could see that on your 2D. I mean, it's like live scope before live scope. So that is the Damiki rig, even though everything is being called the Damiki rig. Again, let me know if I'm off base on this. The other one we're going to get into is tight lining. Now, like I said, I'm a writer. I looked back at my archives. I wrote an article about this in 2015, so almost 10 years ago. Tight lining is huge in East Tennessee as well. Basically, it is a small minnow bait on a jig head, which is what we're using now. Again, this isn't anything new. These techniques have been out forever. They've just kind of slightly evolved. So tight lining, you cast it out there on a tight line and let your bait fall back down like a pendulum. You know, that is a very good technique in a lot of the same situations that I just mentioned with the Damiki rig. You know, cold water, clear water, smallmouth or largemouth, but that is a completely different technique. It is basically just kind of shaking it down, you know, as it's making a pendulum down. So that is tight lining. The other one is kind of more recent, is the hover strolling technique. So of course you got the core tackle hover rig, you know, you put a bait in there, and this is designed for fishing suspended bass. You know, it's really good with forward facing sonar, but you don't have to. I know Matt Steffen talks a lot about fishing this almost like a jig or a Ned rig, you know, just kind of popping it off the bottom and it just kind of darts and dances all over the place. You do not need forward facing sonar to do it. You can use a jig head and a minnow. I mean, it's not really a jig head, I guess it kind of is. This is more of like a weighted hook in my opinion. But you slide that in there and you could use it with a minnow style bait. But you could do it with a worm too. You know, I see a lot of people using baits like the Berkeley flatworm or, you know, the bass tricks, those shad tricks, the little hollow belly shad baits, and they're kind of like a tube almost. So you do not have to have a fluke style bait with this. You can shake it in the water column like some of these other techniques that I talked about, but it really is more of a darting and dancing action. The next one, this is what it's actually called, is mid-strolling. So mid-strolling is casting out there with a jig head, a round ball head, and a minnow. You know, this is the horizon head from Gamakatsu, and this is where you're actually shaking like this, and the bait is rolling, and you're casting it to fish that you see on your screen on forward-facing sonar. And mid-strolling, you're strolling it through the water in the middle part of the water column. This is a technique that came from Japan. It's everywhere you look right now. This is the correct term for, you know, jighead minnow fishing. It's not the Damiki rig. It's not hover strolling. It is mid-strolling. Okay, let's throw one more out there that you hear about sometimes. The moping technique. This was popularized by Gussie, Jeff Gustafson. He won the Elite Series event. He won the Classic on Loudon Teleco with a minnow and a jighead. You know, this is the jighead right here. It is the Smeltonator. You know, it's now part of Northland, you know, but it is the same jighead. This is what he used with the Z-Man minnow. So he cast it out there, and he is kind of mid-strolling, kind of doing a lot of things, but it's a lot more of just kind of floating it through the water column. You know, it is for suspended bass, but if you think of when he did this, he's a hummingbird guy. He was not using live scope when he won his first elite event. It is basically just casting out there, you know, to objects, to rocks, things like that, and just kind of hopping it around and moping, not really doing a lot of action with it. Mainly it is just kind of floating through the water column. And if you looked at any of the video of how he fishes it, it is a lot different than the guys that are mid-strolling. They're shaking the rod like crazy. So there's a lot of different terms out there. So they are different techniques. I mean, that's the thing that I've kind of gathered from talking to a lot of people. There is a huge misinformation campaign almost. Everyone calls it Damiki rig, but it is not. It is mid-strolling if you're talking about shaking a minnow while watching your forward-facing sonar. So let me know, am I wrong on this? I've talked to a lot of people, pros, like I said, just regular weekend guys like myself. I've talked to all kinds of people in the industry, and this is kind of the consensus for all these techniques that are all being grouped into one. So let me know, am I correct with all this? And if not, let me know. I'd like to know. And maybe there's some other ones that I missed. There's so many different names for this. Pinging a minnow, you know, shaking a minnow, all these different techniques. But mainly, they're all different. So thanks for watching. Just wanted to clear that up.